Game of Thrones was a big deal. It's one of the most successful shows ever made, in pretty much every way you can look at it. It brought the fantasy genre back into the mainstream, showing everyone that it can be taken seriously, that it can appeal to a large audience if treated right. Naturally, when one thing is a success, everyone else clocks on and tries to copy it, which leads me to this topic. What is or was the next Game of Thrones? It seems every streaming service and cable provider and network tried to do their own version of it with varied success. Starz came out with Outlander, a great show for a few seasons until it started declining a little bit. It's still good, but not as good as it once was. Being on Starz, its audience and reach was limited, but it garnered a strong following. Book fans were also very happy with it, I believe. But without that reach and mainstream appeal, it failed to be the Game of Thrones contender, but it is the closest they've got. I think its origins as a romantic novel aimed primarily at female readers and viewers has limited its potential. There are some people, particularly men, who won't go near it with a 10-foot pole because of its classification as romance, despite it being a good fantasy show. Netflix came out with Shadow and Bone, a fantasy series with historical allegories and a mix of steampunk and fantasy elements. It again failed to have the same reach and appeal, perhaps because of its origins as a young adult series, which can turn off some older audiences. Also, compared to Game of Thrones, it lacked that finesse and high quality look and appeal. It was certainly well made and it definitely looked good, but there was a whiff of CGI all over it, which isn't present in Game of Thrones. There was also the short-lived continuation of The Dark Crystal, with Game of Thrones-like fantasy vibes, with more fantasy, puppets and fantastic production. It only lasted one season though, because nobody watched it, despite how good it was, and therefore was not the Game of Thrones clone Netflix wanted. Netflix then came out with The Witcher, which is probably the most successful attempt at mimicking the success of Game of Thrones. Based on the books and sort of influenced by the video games, The Witcher TV show has that Game of Thrones look and feel, albeit with more monsters, worse CGI, and a tighter focus on a handful of characters. It was a big hit too. Its success is demonstrated by the addition of a spin-off limited series, an animated movie, and a continuing main series despite its loss of its main star and actor. But while The Witcher has come closest to duplicating the success of Game of Thrones, it does fall short in certain ways, particularly the books it's based on, which personally I do not like. Many of The Witcher's fan base and audience are familiar with it because of the video games, which are fantastic. So the show does fall short of expectations because it adapts books instead of the video games. Prime Video had two attempts to get their Game of Thrones-like show. The first was Carnival Row, starring Orlando Bloom and Cara Delevingne. It's set in a steampunk-like world inhabited by humans, fairies and pucks. It's not based on anything though, so it had to make everything up and take inspiration from other properties. It sort of worked. It's not a great show, but it's enjoyable. Sadly, the big budget and production needs, mixed with the pandemic, meant that Carnival Row has gone several years without a second season. As of recording, the second season is coming out next month, at long last, and it will be the final one. There was a lot of potential here, perhaps not enough to match Game of Thrones, but timing and circumstances jeopardized the success of this show, I think. The next attempt by Amazon was The Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power. This is the most expensive TV show ever made, and it shows. That money is on full display with fantastic special effects, action scenes and production. It definitely looks like a Game of Thrones competitor, and it has the scale and scope to match it too. Where it falls short is in its story and characters, which aren't all that interesting. But it's a very good attempt. It's a little unclear how its viewership matches with Game of Thrones, but a lot of Tolkien fans watched it. Some liked it, others hated it. Disney Plus has had a couple of attempts at a Game of Thrones level show, but hasn't quite tried to duplicate the fantasy elements and genre. There's The Mandalorian, which is its own sort of thing, and there's the new Willow TV show, which is apparently good, but let's face it, Willow isn't the best known or most beloved of franchises or properties, so it's probably not a Game of Thrones competitor. Game of Thrones is one of the most successful TV shows ever made. Everyone else has tried to jump on the bandwagon, creating their own fantasy-based shows, some based on books, others on games. Others were original ideas. None of them have matched the success of Game of Thrones on a critical level. None of them have matched the viewership numbers on the widespread appeal of Game of Thrones. Although perhaps The Witcher came closest. House of a Dragon released last year, proving once again that Game of Thrones as a brand has a certain something that appeals to a mass audience. Perhaps it isn't wise to try and copy Game of Thrones by creating new fantasy properties. Perhaps one should just look and think that maybe it's just that particular story and world that's appealing, rather than the genre, the scale, the scope and the budget. There's a lot to think about here. Are there actual Game of Thrones competitors, or merely a bunch of wannabes? Let me know in the comments what you think and supply your own topics of discussion too. I might address them in future episodes. Also, subscribe to my channel and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at @the_Grant Burton. Thanks for watching.